welcome to the Book Binge. I am your host, King Crusoe, but you can call me KC, and in today's episode, we are covering Wrath by John Gwynne, the final book of The Faithful and the Fallen at last. Just a couple short weeks after I finished reading Ruin, I started reading Wrath, and just about a month after I reviewed Ruin, now comes the review for Wrath. But before we get into anything crazy with this review and actually go into the proper sections as normally follows, I will actually recommend that you check out my Goodreads review for Wrath if you have read the book entirely, because I think that review actually does a really great job of explaining my thoughts on it and utilizing some level of spoilers to actually do so, as most of my reviews, and in particular this review that you're watching, is going to be spoiler free. It'll be a little bit harder to actually talk about some of the specific reasons why I might feel the way that I do about certain things in this book. So if you want a better detailed explanation for basically my feelings and thoughts on Wrath, the Goodreads review I think is a very good avenue for that. But without further ado, let's jump into the regular review for the final book in this series, starting off with the good, just as I normally do. Now there's going to be several things here that kind of tie back to and reflect some of the things that I've said are the good of, like Valor and Ruin. The first thing that I'm going to shout out as being one of these good things is that I feel like Wrath handles the time frame in which it takes place relatively well. Now there's going to be a caveat to this that we talk about in the next section, but generally speaking, I feel like the timeline of Wrath is pretty good, especially since a lot of it takes place in a somewhat more condensed time period compared to previous books, where Malice takes place over 2 years or so, and Valor and Ruin approximately both take place in 1 year. You can kind of tell that Wrath does not take place over quite as long a period of time, or at least it utilizes the period of time in which it is set more intentionally, and there's less like time jumps, less like, oh, it was a 10 night ago or something like that. You get a little bit less of that in this final book compared to previous entries, which I think actually kind of works. There's a sense of tension that is inherently built by the novel and by Gwynne in the writing of the novel, just on account of using a little bit less gaps in time, a little bit less space in there. Feels like things are a little bit more connected, or like I said, things are definitely more tense as a result of there being less space in which it technically gets to breathe, in spite of some of those things being off the page. So the time frame of Wrath I felt like was pretty good and helped me to enjoy it a good bit, especially while I was plowing through the first 2/3 or so of the book, when things are like just happening right after the other between the different timelines, even back and forth between timelines, which actually kind of segues me into the next thing that I'm going to say is really great about Wrath, and that is the converging of storylines, where you have narrative threads throughout the series kind of weaving and going back and forth, certain characters kind of coming and being associated with one another, and then like splitting off and different branching paths taking place over the course of the series. Wrath does a lot to actually bring basically everything together kind of in one little burst after the other. This was one of the things that I really enjoyed about the book, was seeing these POVs, these plot lines come together and actually work together and march straight on towards the climax of the book. But I feel like a lot of the reason that Gwynne was able to be effective with the converging of the storylines was because of splitting POVs and the storylines out in a more unique manner this time around compared to previous entries, where oftentimes you're jumping between a bunch of POVs and between different storylines, kind of one after the other, and maybe you'll have a couple chapters in a row that are with one story, or with one plot line rather, and then you move on to another and kind of do that whole thing throughout the whole book. Wrath takes a very different approach and very often ends up having several dozen page long sections that are just bouncing back and forth between two POVs, and like maybe introducing a third like tangential POV that is from a different plot line in the middle, sort of somewhere, like breaking off like an 80-page section into 40 and 40 with a short break in the middle. Like there's just generally more longer sections that are bouncing back and forth between relevant POVs with each other, taking on a storyline, getting it to a point where some other storyline is ready to converge with it, and then taking it from there. And I really enjoyed being able to spend more time with plot lines in specificity going in that direction rather than hopping back and forth between everything. Even though I really liked that in Valor especially, I really loved following all the storylines, and I felt like the balance between POVs was done really well there. Something about the way that Wrath actually just kind of hones in on one specific storyline at a time, kind of circling through these things. I enjoyed that approach to Wrath quite a bit as well. And similar to the way that Gwynne approached the plotting and actually following different storylines, following different plot lines a little bit differently in this book, making them longer sections versus just the bounce back and forth a million times, he also took a slightly different approach to the setting of Wrath compared to previous books, because a lot of Wrath takes place in basically one place, or if it doesn't take place in that one location, it takes place in just a few locations very nearby, where a lot of the action can kind of still be seen between different POVs. And even though there's plotting, even though there's a little bit of distance between certain sections of the book, a lot of it takes place in a more condensed portion of the map of the Banished Lands than previous books have, where bouncing back and forth between different POVs means you're bouncing between 15,000 different parts of the world. Wrath does a lot less of that. There is one storyline that is still very far in the south for much of the story, but there's also a big, heavy utilization of the location of Drassel here, and a lot of the story actually focuses around here and in the surrounding area. And I enjoyed the fact that Gwynne decided to actually stay rooted in a place rather than just traveling all across the continent and the world like the last two books have. If this was just a third book in a row where that was basically the only major thing happening, that would be kind of questionable. I appreciated that there was more focus on specific settings, because even the plotline in the south is basically staying where it is the entire time until they move up to Drassel, and that's where the rest of the book takes place, basically. Like I said, there's some offshoots, there's some sections that take place in a slightly more east location and a slightly more west location, but they're still kind of in that region-ish with Drassel, and I liked this a lot. Another positive for Wrath, continuing on from basically what I've said in both the Valor and the Ruined reviews, is that I've really enjoyed the characters in this series. While I was pretty mixed or not so sure about a lot of the character decisions, or a lot of the decisions that Gwynne was making with the characters rather in Malice, the first book, the rest of the books I've generally been on board with more or less everything, and I felt like there was no less soul to the character work in Wrath, so that is definitely a big bonus. Next up, I want to talk about the Holy War aspect of the series, because if you recall from my review of Ruin, I wasn't a particular fan of the ending of that book insofar as a revelation with the Holy War is concerned. Now, this is going to be, I guess to some degree, major spoilers, but minor spoilers. Let's just say this is going to be spoilers for the end of Ruin. I'm not going to say what happens in this plotline from Wrath, but I will say what happened at the end of Ruin. So if you want to skip this, I guess I'll put a time code on screen that will be relevant. But the main thing that I disliked about the Holy War aspect of the Faithful and the Fallen in Ruin was the revelation that the entire prophecy was fake and more or less entirely made up by Mikal, or however his character's name is pronounced. I've heard people say it Michael or whatever. I'm saying Mikal because that's how I read it and that's how it looks on the page. Sue me. Anyway, what I'm saying is that the Holy War aspect of the series was something that I was really interested in, basically all the way up until that point at the end of Ruin, where I thought that there were going to be some interesting twists taken, or generally just a good usage of that kind of aspect in the series. But the twist that it was all made up, or at least that the prophecy was more or less all made up, really didn't work for me. And even now, I'm still not the biggest fan of that twist, but I do have to commend Wrath for utilizing that reveal, utilizing that twist, and actually continuing to take it in a direction that I appreciated, that was thematically relevant to certain character arcs and journeys, and that still worked for the series without holding it back to any major degree. Because I was so turned off by that reveal at the end of Ruin, I was really worried that this aspect would just not work for me at all in Wrath, but I wasn't bothered by it in Wrath. In fact, I actually liked where it took that reveal, even if I still don't like the reveal itself. And finally, my last major praise for Wrath is going to be not just the battle sequences, which is something that I've praised in both Ruin and in Valor already, but the sieges. Because of the storylines, because of the plot lines generally being focused on for longer periods of time, having more pages dedicated to them in Wrath compared to previous books. There's also the fact that battles are not just little skirmishes that only take like a chapter or two to resolve, or aren't just sequences that are broken up over a longer period of time. They are full-on sieges that have a much bigger impact on the actual story, that have a much bigger impact on where certain character storylines are going, and have much more importance in the grand scheme of things, and also encompass multiple POVs. And this is a lot of why the switching back and forth between multiple characters within a particular storyline works for an extended page count in this book, is because a lot of these sequences take a long time to get through, and you're getting to see various different angles, various different aspects of this from the multiple POVs, and it gives you a very broad understanding of like what's happening in the scene, despite the colorings of both, or in some cases all of the POVs associated therein. I think that Gwynne handled this quite well. But now we come into the portion of the bad, because there are a few things that I do want to notate for Wrath. In comparison to Ruin, which had like one or two major decisions, relatively major decisions that I wasn't too hot on, Wrath had a few more smaller things that I had gripes with, we'll say. The first thing is, as I referenced at the very beginning of The Good, there's a little bit of wonkiness to the timeline in the beginning of this book as a result of how Ruin ends. So this is kind of like a holy war thing insofar as I wasn't a huge fan of how certain things were handled in Ruin, or specifically at the end of Ruin, and that caused for certain things to have a little bit more sourness at the beginning in Wrath, but which fixed itself as time went on. I would say the weird thing about Wrath in comparison to Ruin is that there's a particular storyline in Ruin that ends a good bit before the end of the book, because it ends before the major climax of the book happens. As a result of this, Wrath starting off with that plot line and then going to a different plot line for the second chapter before returning to this starting plot line for a good long while adds a little bit of whiplash factor to where the specific storyline actually takes place. It became a little bit confusing. I'm like, wait a minute, how does this actually happen in relation to the end of Ruin? And the answer is that like it kind of doesn't, and time is a little bit squishy in the series anyway. Like you can kind of justify where things happen in almost every case, but this was one time where I was like, I don't know about that one. I think you should have just kept the very, very end of Ruin and like actually had it more or less at the beginning and incorporated some of those timeline differences, some of that timeline wonkiness a little bit better. That's my opinion. There was definitely a little bit of weird timeline stuff at the beginning of this one here that I personally wasn't super into. It did fix itself, however. Like I said, I liked the way that Gwynne handled time generally through the book, even if it started off a little bit weird. Next up is a specific plotline, which I will not spoil. I will not bring any spoilers up into this section here, but I will say that Lycos's / Macwin's storyline had a little bit of a gap is at some portion of this book that feels like it's entirely missing. That's not to say that like there's a lot of like major stuff that happens there, but I felt like there were some notable scenes that were like you could have explored a little bit more with some of the thoughts and feelings of a couple of those characters, especially Macwin, and had it be very impactful from a character perspective that just were not written. There's also the fact that like if you're going to follow this journey with a couple characters going to a specific place for a section of the book, going there and not at all ever talking about them coming back, despite there being some pretty major events that happen in the storyline along the other part of the journey, feels weird for that other leg to just be entirely missing. And that was a problem that I had, which we will expand upon with my final point in the bad of Wrath, and that is basically that I felt like there were certain aspects to the climax that were a little bit underwhelming, not because the climax itself was underwhelming, but because of how much longer it took me to read those last 200 pages than the last 400 or the first 400 pages. It took me as long to read the final act, the actual climax of the book, as it did to read everything before that because of how busy I was. So like my reading experience with the climax felt a little bit underwhelming, even if the climax itself wasn't. But I would say that the thing that was actually underwhelming for me was a lot of the resolution of the book. And that is because there was like 3 or something chapters that are very short, like maybe even less than 5-page chapters which just do not do enough to wrap up everything that just happened, not just in the climax, but in the series as a whole. I wish more of the POVs got more resolution, and I wish there was more page time dedicated to this kind of thing. In fact, this was one of the things that I praised a lot about, say, the Return to Adan by Philip Chase, last book in the Adan trilogy, is that Return to Adan is basically all the resolution and aftermath type of storyline to Prophet of Adan, which would typically, ordinarily, be the climax of a traditional fantasy series. The climax is what you would expect to see in book 2, but then you have an entire book 3 after that, which turns out to be even longer. I feel like The Faithful and the Fallen needed more pages, not just because of certain scenes that I feel like are missing with like the Lycos plotline, as I said before, but also a lot because there's not enough resolution at the end of the book as a rule. Like, you have a couple of the main characters like going through and like kind of mentioning some characters and being like, oh yeah, this is what that person's doing now, like a week after the climactic sequence or something like that. But it doesn't feel particularly effective. It doesn't like actually move me or anything, because you're not getting to actually see resolution or see any of those things happen from those characters' points of view, and I thought that that was a little bit disappointing. But now, at last, we come to the recommendation of Wrath, the final book in The Faithful and the Fallen. I would say, if you have read through Valor and you are into the series, definitely finish the series. There's nothing with Ruin and Wrath that are going to turn you off so bad that you will regret having finished the series. And to hearken on what I said in the Ruin review, my recommendation of that anyway, was that a lot of people actually think that Ruin, for example, is the best book of the series, whereas I don't think that Ruin is the best book in the series. So if you enjoy Valor, you know that you're into the series, continue, because you may very well think that Ruin or Wrath are your favorite book in the series, like a not small amount of other people that I know do, and I think that that would totally be worth it. It's a pretty simple recommendation. I think if you've read the first book and you like it, or if you've read through Valor and you like it, the series is going to be something that you enjoy enough to finish, and that you should probably finish it as a result. Unless you adore the battle stuff, I don't personally think that Wrath will be your favorite, but that's ultimately up to you to decide if you read the books. It's not quite my favorite, but you'll see my full-on ranking for the series next week, actually, when I do a full series ranking and kind of general wrap-up for Faithful and the Fallen. That's something that I'm really looking forward to. So tune in next week for the full series review and ranking. I had a great time with the series. I'm glad that I finally circled back around to it after so long in between Malice and Valor, and I'm glad that I finished it up in relatively short succession and therefore finished the series in 2024. That was great. That definitely felt great, and I'm happy about that. But thank you for watching if you did. I hope you stick around to watch that video next week, ranking the entire series. I'm looking forward to it myself. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe, but you can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys next week.